The wind that moves across the southern plains of Iraq carries a specific kind of weight. It is a dry, biting heat that tastes of salt and pulverized stone, a wind that has been scouring the same flat horizon for 6,000 years. Beneath the feet of a traveler, the ground is not merely earth. It is a graveyard of intentions. Every step kicks up a fine, pale powder that was once a brick, once a wall, once a home where a family sought shelter from this very same sun. To stand in the center of the desert between the Tigris and the Euphrates is to stand in the middle of a long, slow conversation between the sky and the ground, a conversation where the earth has spent millennia trying to pull everything back down into its dark, silent belly. Imagine a moment of stillness in the mid-19th century. A shovel bites into a mound of earth that looks like any other hill in a land of endless ridges. But the sound is wrong. Instead of the dull thud of packed dirt, there is a sharp, crystalline crack. The worker reaches down into the heat-soaked soil and pulls back a fragment of fired clay. It is small, no larger than a human palm, but it is heavy. It feels like a piece of the planet's own bone. Across its surface, there are no paintings of animals or simple tallies of grain. Instead, there are rows of sharp, rhythmic wedges pressed into the clay while it was still wet and soft. These marks are tight and disciplined. They look like the footprints of birds frozen in mid-flight. As the dust is brushed away, more fragments appear. Hundreds, then thousands. They are found in collapsed libraries, buried under 30 feet of silt and forgotten memory. These are the records of Sumer, and they do not begin with a whisper. They begin with a claim so vast and so demanding that it threatens to pull the rug out from under every story we have told ourselves about who we are. We have been taught to see history as a steady climb, a slow walk out of the shadows of the cave and into the light of the city. We imagine our ancestors as people of limited horizons, struggling to understand the basic mechanics of the world around them. But the clay tells a different story. It speaks of a world that was already old when the first pyramids were being planned. It speaks of a people who looked at the night sky and saw not just lights, but a clockwork mechanism of terrifying precision. The records do not describe a beginning, they describe a legacy. They suggest that the cradle of civilization was not built from scratch, but was instead a reconstruction, a desperate attempt to hold onto a knowledge that was already slipping through the fingers of a humanity that had survived a great erasing. The earth is an expert at forgetting. It does not like to keep secrets on its surface. It prefers to pull them deep into the crushing pressure of the mantle or wash them away into the lightless canyons of the sea. When we look at the history of our planet, we are looking at a book where most of the pages have been torn out and burned. The very ground we stand on is constantly moving, shifting its weight like a sleeper in a restless night. The continents slide across the molten heart of the world, and where they collide, the crust is forced downward, melted, and recycled. This is the process of subduction, a slow-motion grinding that can turn a mountain range into liquid fire over millions of years. But on a human scale, the erasure is even more relentless. Consider the power of water. The rivers that birthed the first cities, the Tigris and the Euphrates, are not static lines on a map. They are living, breathing serpents of silt. Over the course of 10,000 years, they have changed their paths dozens of times, wandering across the plains like lost travelers. Every time a river shifts, it carries with it the debris of the world. It deposits layers of mud that act like a heavy, suffocating blanket. A city that stood in the sunlight 5,000 years ago can be buried under 20 feet of river sediment in a few centuries. The weight of this mud is immense. It presses down, squeezing the air out of the ruins, crushing the timber beams and the woven mats, until all that remains is a thin, dark line in the strata. Then there is the chemistry of the air and the soil. Most of what we build is fragile. Wood rots in the damp. Iron rusts and flakes away into orange dust. Even the hardest granite will eventually succumb to the slow, rhythmic heartbeat of the seasons, expanding in the heat, contracting in the cold, until tiny fissures become cracks, and cracks become a pile of gravel. To find anything at all from the deep past is a miracle of preservation. It requires a specific set of circumstances: a sudden burial, a dry environment, and a material that can withstand the weight of time. The Sumerians chose clay. They took the very mud that threatened to bury them, shaped it into tablets, and fired it in kilns until it became as hard as the stones of the mountain. They knew that the earth would try to reclaim their story, and they built their records to resist the crush of the soil. But even with their foresight, we are only seeing a fraction of a percent of what they knew. We are like people trying to reconstruct a complex machine by looking at a few rusted bolts found in a field. The stakes of this investigation are not merely academic. If the Sumerian records are correct, then our timeline of human development is not just slightly off, it is fundamentally broken. We are forced to ask if the rise of civilization was actually a recovery. We have to wonder if the sudden appearance of mathematics, law, medicine, and astronomy in the marshes of Iraq was the spark of a new flame, or the glowing embers of a fire that had been burning long before the ice retreated from the northern world. The Earth's skin is thick with the scars of these forgotten eras, and the Sumerian tablets are the first voices to break the silence of the silt. The first great paradox of the Sumerian records is found in a document known as the King List. It is a piece of stone, four-sided and covered in that same rhythmic wedge-shaped script. It begins with a simple, chilling sentence. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. This is not presented as a myth or a poem. It is presented as a ledger. It lists the names of rulers and the cities they governed, one after another, with the cold efficiency of a tax record. But as the translation continues, the numbers begin to defy reason. The first king of Eridu is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. The next king ruled for 36,000 years. To the modern mind, these numbers are an immediate signal to stop taking the text literally. We are taught that these are metaphors, or perhaps a way of honoring ancestors by granting them impossible lifespans. We assume that the early scribes were conflating dynasties with individuals, or perhaps using a different system of counting that we have yet to decode. Skepticism is the natural wall we build to protect our understanding of biology and time. Humans do not live for 30,000 years. Therefore, the record must be a fiction, a legend meant to provide a sense of ancient authority to a young culture. We label it mythological and move on to the later sections of the list where the reigns become more recognizable: 40 years, 15 years, 12 years. But if we stay in the paradox, a different picture begins to emerge. The king list makes a very specific distinction. It lists 8 kings who ruled before a massive event it calls the deluge. These 8 kings are the ones with the massive multi-thousand-year reigns. Then, the text says, the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. From that point on, the reigns begin to shrink. They drop from thousands of years to hundreds of years, and eventually to the normal lifespans of mortal men. The rebuttal to the mythology argument lies in the structure of the record itself. If these were simply legends, one would expect the stories to become more fantastic as they went on, or for the transitions to be blurred. Instead, the king list is jarringly consistent. It treats the 30,000-year reign and the 10-year reign with the exact same linguistic weight. Furthermore, the Sumerians were obsessed with mathematics. Their system of counting was based on the number 60, a system we still use today to measure our time and the degrees of a circle. They were not a people prone to exaggeration for the sake of flair. They were a people of inventory. When we look at the geological record, we find that there were indeed periods of massive climatic upheaval at the end of the last ice age, a time when the meltwater from the glaciers caused sea levels to rise by hundreds of feet, swallowing coastal plains and turning river valleys into inland seas. If we consider the possibility that these long rains are not a count of solar years as we understand them, but a reference to a different cycle, or perhaps a different state of human existence entirely, the mystery deepens. Some researchers have pointed out that the numbers in the king list are perfectly divisible by the precessional cycle of the Earth, the slow wobble of the planet's axis that takes 26,000 years to complete. This suggests that the Sumerians were not just counting days. They were tracking the movement of the planet through the stars on a scale that requires thousands of years of observation. To dismiss these records as mere fantasy is to ignore the mathematical precision that underpins them. The paradox remains: how could a primitive people possess a record of time that spans tens of thousands of years with such internal consistency? The second cycle of this investigation leads us from the earth up to the sky. In the dust of the ruins of Nineveh, archaeologists discovered a circular tablet that has come to be known as the planisphere. It is a map of the stars, but it is not a map made by someone wandering in the dark. It is a sophisticated astronomical instrument. It shows the positions of the stars and constellations, but it also includes calculations of planetary movements that shouldn't have been possible for thousands of more years. The paradox here is one of optics and calculation. To understand the movements of the outer planets, planets that cannot be seen with the naked eye, you need two things: time and tools. The Sumerian records describe the colors and characteristics of planets like Uranus and Neptune, calling them blue-green and watery. In our modern timeline, Uranus was not discovered until 1781, and Neptune in 1846, both requiring the use of powerful telescopes. The Sumerians, however, had been writing about them on clay for millennia. They described the solar system not as a series of lights in the sky, but as a family of bodies orbiting a central sun. This heliocentric view, placing the sun at the center, would not be accepted by modern science until the time of Copernicus, yet it was the foundation of Sumerian cosmology. Skepticism offers a simple explanation. It is a coincidence. Perhaps they saw a bright star and assigned it a name, and our modern interpretation is simply projecting our own knowledge onto their vague descriptions. Skeptics argue that without glass lenses and metal tubes, there is no physical way a Sumerian astronomer could have seen the rings of Saturn or the moons of Jupiter. They suggest that the Sumerians were simply gifted poets who happened to get lucky with their celestial guesses. But the rebuttal is etched in the math. The Sumerian tablets contain tables of reciprocals, squares, and cubes. They contain calculations for the appearance of eclipses that are accurate to within seconds. They understood the concept of the Great Year, the 25,920-year cycle of the stars, and they used it to anchor their history. This is not the work of lucky guessers. This is the work of a civilization that possessed a deep, inherited knowledge of the mechanics of the solar system. When we look at their cylinder seals, small stone rollers used to print images into clay, we see depictions of the solar system that show the relative sizes of the planets with startling accuracy. They show the planets in their correct order from the sun. How does a civilization that has just emerged from the Stone Age develop the mathematics to calculate the orbits of planets they cannot see? The presence of this knowledge suggests that the Sumerians were not the inventors of this science, but the curators of it. They were holding onto a map of the heavens that had been handed down from an era that the Earth has since reclaimed. They were looking at the stars through eyes that had been trained by a much older, lost tradition of observation. The third cycle brings us back down to the ground, to the very structure of the Sumerian society. When we dig through the layers of the earth in Mesopotamia, we see something that troubles the traditional view of human progress. Usually, in the geological record, you see a slow progression. You see simple tools, then slightly better tools, then the first signs of a permanent hut, then a small village. It is a staircase of development. But in Sumer, the staircase is missing. Instead of a slow climb, we see a vertical leap. One moment, the record shows scattered groups of hunter-gatherers and simple farmers. The next, there are fully realized cities with complex irrigation systems, monumental architecture, professional bureaucracies, and a complete system of writing. The Sumerians didn't just discover law. They produced the Code of Ur-Nammu, a sophisticated legal system that predates the famous Code of Hammurabi by centuries. They didn't just start farming. They engineered the landscape, turning a swampy wasteland into a garden through a network of canals that required advanced knowledge of hydraulics and leveling. The paradox is the absence of a beta version of Sumer. Where are the half-finished experiments in city building? Where is the primitive form of their writing? The cuneiform script appears almost fully formed, capable of expressing not just business transactions, but complex philosophical ideas and the nuances of human emotion. Skepticism suggests that we simply haven't found the earlier sites yet. The desert is vast, and much of it remains unexcavated. It is argued that the leap is an illusion created by the gaps in our archaeological record. We see the finished product and assume it happened overnight, but in reality, there were thousands of years of trial and error that have simply been lost to the shifting sands. However, the rebuttal lies in the sheer scale of what was achieved. A city like Uruk at its height housed upwards of 50,000 people. To support such a population, you need more than just luck. You need a standardized system of weights and measures, a way to track the passage of time for planting and harvesting, a medical system to deal with the diseases of density, and a social structure that can keep the peace. The Sumerians had all of these things from the very beginning of their recorded history. They also possessed a strange, anomalous engineering capability. They built their temples, or ziggurats, on massive platforms made of millions of bricks. But within these structures, we find evidence of a precision that is difficult to explain. The orientation of these buildings to the cardinal points of the compass is nearly perfect. The bitumen they used for waterproofing is a complex petroleum product that requires a specific refining process. They were using high heat kilns to create faience and other materials that require temperatures in excess of 1,500 degrees. This is not the technology of a people who have just learned to plant seeds. It is the technology of a people who understand the chemical and physical properties of the earth on a level that suggests a long, deep history of industrial experimentation. The fourth cycle examines the Sumerian accounts of their own origins. In almost every piece of literature they left behind, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the Enuma Elish, they do not take credit for their own achievements. They are very clear about where their knowledge came from. They say it was taught to them by the Anunnaki, a term that translates roughly to those who from heaven to earth came. The paradox here is the conflict between the physical reality of the Sumerian achievements and their own testimony. We have the physical evidence of their cities, their math, and their laws. These things are real, but when we ask them how they did it, they point to the sky and to a group of beings they describe as their teachers and, in some accounts, their creators. Skepticism tells us that this is just the standard language of ancient religion. Every ancient culture has gods. Every culture attributes the unknown to the divine. We are told that the Anunnaki are simply personifications of the forces of nature, the storm, the sun, the water. To take their stories of celestial teachers literally is to move out of the realm of history and into the realm of science fiction. But the rebuttal comes from the way the Sumerians described these beings. They did not describe them as ethereal spirits or distant ghosts. They described them as physical entities who lived among them, who had specific needs, who got tired, who argued with each other, and who used tools. The tablets describe the Anunnaki using shining stones to light their chambers and whirlwinds to move through the sky. They describe a process of shaping humanity that sounds remarkably like a description of genetic engineering, taking a primitive being and fixing upon it the image of the gods. Most tellingly, the Sumerians recorded the 7 sages, or the Apkallu, who were said to have emerged from the sea to teach humanity the arts of civilization. These sages are often depicted in stone carvings wearing what look like fishskin suits or sophisticated cloaks. They brought with them the me, which were a set of physical objects, perhaps some form of data storage, that contained the blueprints for everything from kingship and priesthood to the art of metalworking and music. The Sumerians didn't claim to have invented these things. They claimed to have been given them. If we look at this not through the lens of religion, but as a historical account of a transfer of technology, the sudden leap of Sumerian civilization begins to make sense. It wasn't an evolution, it was an inheritance. As we bring these threads together, a unifying theory begins to take shape, one that is as heavy as the clay tablets themselves. The Sumerian records are not a collection of fairy tales. They are a surviving fragment of a much larger, global story that has been almost entirely erased by the Earth's natural cycles. We are looking at a civilization that was founded in the wake of a global catastrophe, the deluge, and was tasked with preserving the core knowledge of a lost era. This theory suggests that before the end of the last ice age, there was a sophisticated human presence on this planet. This precursor civilization understood the stars, the math of the planet, and the chemistry of the Earth. But they were living on a world that was about to change. As the ice melted and the oceans rose, their coastal cities, where most civilizations are built, were swallowed by the sea. Their records were washed away, their monuments were crushed by the weight of the rising water, and their survivors were scattered. The Sumerians were the heirs to this catastrophe. They settled in the fertile mud of Mesopotamia because it was a place where they could rebuild. They used the knowledge that had been preserved, the me, the records of the 7 sages, to jumpstart a new world. This is why their civilization appears so suddenly. This is why their math is so advanced. This is why they were obsessed with tracking the stars. They weren't looking up in wonder. They were looking up in order to keep time, to make sure they knew where they were in the great year, and to monitor the sky for any sign that the destruction might return. The Anunnaki and the 7 sages may not have been gods in the sense we understand them today. They may have been the elite members of that precursor civilization, the scientists, the engineers, the keepers of the flame, who appeared to the surviving hunter-gatherers as beings of immense power. They provided the blueprints for a new way of living, a way of organizing humanity so that the knowledge would not be lost again. Sumer was a time capsule, a massive living monument to a forgotten Earth. This realization changes everything we know about ourselves. It suggests that we are a species with amnesia. We look at our history and see a short 6,000-year sprint, but the Sumerian records suggest we have been around for much, much longer. They suggest that the primitive state of humanity is not our natural starting point, but rather the state we fall into when the Earth decides to reset the board. Today, we live in a world that feels permanent. We build with steel and glass, we store our data on servers, and we believe we have conquered the elements. But the lessons of Sumer are a quiet warning. The Earth is still shifting. The rivers are still moving. The crust is still being recycled. If a catastrophe on the scale of the deluge were to happen today, how much of our world would remain in 5,000 years? Our digital records would vanish in a decade. Our steel would rust away in a century. Our great cities, built on the coasts, would be buried under the same silt that now hides the temples of Eridu and Uruk. In the end, all that might remain of us is what we can carve into the earth itself. We are part of a long, repeating cycle of rising and falling, of remembering and forgetting. The Sumerians knew this. They lived in the shadow of the kingship that descended from heaven, and they worked tirelessly to make sure their voices would be heard across the abyss of time. They were the first to write, not because they wanted to trade grain, but because they knew that the silence of the earth is patient and absolute. To look into the Sumerian records is to look into a mirror. We see a people who were remarkably like us, ambitious, organized, fearful of the dark, and deeply curious about the stars. But we also see a people who knew they were not the first. They lived with the humility of survivors. They understood that civilization is a fragile thing, a thin skin of order stretched over a volatile and ever-changing planet. As the sun sets over the ruins of southern Iraq, the shadows of the broken Ziggurats stretch across the sand. They look like long, dark fingers reaching out to touch the future. The wind continues its work, slowly turning the remaining bricks back into dust. But the tablets are still there, buried in the deeper layers, waiting for a hand to brush away the silt. They hold the story of a humanity that is older, wiser, and more resilient than we have ever dared to imagine. They remind us that we are not the masters of time, but its custodians. And they whisper a truth that we are only just beginning to understand. The past is not behind us. It is beneath us, waiting to be remembered. If you find yourself drawn to these echoes of a forgotten world, perhaps it is because something in you remembers the weight of the clay and the rhythm of the stars. The story of Sumer is your story, a chapter in a long, atmospheric journey that is far from over. There is much more to uncover in the deep layers of the earth, and the light of the first grain is still burning for those who know where to look. To understand the true depth of the Sumerian mystery, we must look away from the dry, cracked earth of the modern desert and turn our gaze toward the water. The history of the world is often written in the margins of the map, in the places where the land meets the sea. For the people of Sumer, the water was not just a resource, it was the origin. They spoke of a time when the Persian Gulf did not look as it does today. Thousands of years ago, the geography of the region was fundamentally different. During the height of the last ice age, so much of the Earth's water was locked away in massive, miles-thick sheets of ice that the sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than they are now. The Persian Gulf was not a sea at all. It was a vast, fertile valley, a lush basin fed by the prehistoric versions of the Tigris and the Euphrates. This was a hidden garden, protected from the harsh winds of the high plateaus, a place where a civilization could have flourished in isolation for millennia while the rest of the world was gripped by the cold. As the planet began to warm, the ice did not melt in a slow, polite trickle. It happened in violent pulses, sudden collapses of ice dams that released unimaginable volumes of water into the global ocean. Imagine the sound of a wall of water, hundreds of miles wide, surging into a valley that had been dry for 20,000 years. The Sumerians called this the Abzu, the deep, sweet water that exists beneath the earth. In their records, they described their oldest city, Eridu, as being built upon the very edge of this watery abyss. They believed that their gods lived within the depths, and that the knowledge of civilization had been brought up from these submerged halls. To a modern geologist, this myth sounds like a precise, if poetic, description of the flooding of the Persian Gulf basin. The gods coming from the water may have been the survivors of that submerged valley, moving inland as the sea swallowed their homes, carrying with them the blueprints of a society that had already reached its peak. This brings us to the fifth cycle of our investigation, the anomaly of the Sumerian language itself. In the study of human history, language is usually a map. We can trace the movement of people by the way their words change, the way sounds migrate and evolve over time. Most languages belong to families, great trees of communication where branches like Latin, Germanic, or Sanskrit can be traced back to a common root. But Sumerian is different. It is what linguists call a language isolate. It has no known relatives. It does not belong to any of the language families that surrounded it in the ancient Near East. It appeared in the record fully formed, with a complex grammar and a vocabulary that seems to have no ancestors in the local soil. The paradox of the language is its sheer technicality. Sumerian is a language of precision, built for law, for science, and for the meticulous recording of data. It is not a primitive tongue of simple grunts and basic descriptions. It is a tool of high-level thought. Skepticism suggests that we simply haven't found the missing link languages that led to Sumerian, that they were spoken by nomadic tribes who left no written record. We are told that the Sumerians likely migrated from somewhere else, perhaps the mountains to the east or the islands to the south, and brought their unique language with them. But the rebuttal lies in the persistence of the language. Even after the Sumerian people were absorbed by the Akkadians and other groups, their language did not die. For another 2,000 years, Sumerian remained the language of the elite, the language of science, and the language of the sacred. It was the Latin of the ancient world, held onto with a desperate reverence. Why would a culture cling so fiercely to a tongue that was so difficult to learn and so different from their own? Perhaps because they believed the language itself was a gift, a specific engineered code designed to preserve the high-level concepts of the era before the flood. The Sumerians didn't just speak a language. They utilized a system of logic that had been handed down to them, a system that allowed them to categorize the world with a granularity that no other contemporary culture could match. The weight of this inherited knowledge is most visible in their understanding of the material world. When we look at the artifacts of Sumer, we are looking at the results of a chemistry that shouldn't have existed. They were masters of the alloy. They understood how to combine copper and tin in the exact proportions to create bronze that was hard enough to hold an edge but flexible enough not to shatter. This is not a process of accident. To create bronze, you must find tin, a metal that is not naturally found in Mesopotamia. This means the Sumerians had established trade routes that stretched thousands of miles, reaching into the heart of Europe or the mountains of Central Asia, and they had the metallurgical knowledge to refine these ores in high-temperature furnaces. The paradox of their engineering extends to the very bricks they used to build their world. They did not just sun-dry mud. They understood the structural benefits of firing clay. They developed various types of cements and bitumens to bind their buildings together, making them resistant to the salt and the damp of the marshlands. In their records, they describe the use of mold-made bricks, a precursor to modern mass production. This allowed them to build on a scale that was previously unthinkable. They weren't just building temples. They were building artificial mountains, the Ziggurats, which served as both religious centers and astronomical observatories. Skepticism points out that humans are resourceful. If you give a group of people enough time and a challenging environment, they will eventually figure out how to build better shelters and stronger tools. We are told that the Sumerians were simply the first to have the perfect storm of conditions: fertile soil, constant water, and a central location that encouraged trade. Their achievements are seen as the natural outcome of a growing population. But the rebuttal is found in the me, the strange, physical objects we touched on earlier. The Sumerian texts describe the goddess Inanna traveling to Eridu to trick the god Enki into giving her these me. The list of what these objects contained is exhaustive. It included the me of weaving, the me of metalworking, the me of the scribe, the me of the priest, and even the me of perpetual motion or victory. These were described as actual items that could be loaded onto a boat and transported. If we strip away the mythological language, we are left with a description of a transfer of technology. It sounds less like a religious story and more like a catalog of salvaged data. If the Sumerians were rebuilding in the wake of a global disaster, the me would have been the most precious cargo in the world, the condensed, portable knowledge of the civilization that had been lost to the rising tides. This brings us to a deeper, more unsettling layer of the Sumerian record, their understanding of the human body and the nature of life itself. In the ruins of their libraries, we have found medical texts that list hundreds of different botanical remedies, but also descriptions of surgical procedures. They used obsidian blades, sharper than any modern steel scalpel, to perform delicate operations. They understood the importance of hygiene and the role of unseen forces in the spread of disease, long before the modern discovery of germs. But even more striking are the cylinder seals that appear to depict the very foundations of life. Some of these seals show entwined serpents, a symbol that has been used for millennia to represent healing. But when we look at the way these serpents are depicted, the specific way they twist around a central axis, it bears a haunting resemblance to the double helix structure of DNA. The Sumerian creation myths describe the shaping of humanity in a house of Shimti, a word that translates to the house where the breath of life is given. In these stories, the gods do not create man out of nothing. They take a pre-existing creature of the earth and mix it with the blood or essence of one of the gods. They describe a process of trial and error, of failed experiments that resulted in beings that were not quite right until they finally achieved the perfected human. The paradox here is almost too large to grasp. How could a civilization from 6,000 years ago have any concept of genetic manipulation or the microscopic building blocks of life? Skepticism insists that this is a classic case of pareidolia, the human tendency to see familiar patterns in random shapes. We see a double helix because we know what a double helix looks like. The Sumerians, we are told, were just drawing snakes because snakes were common in the desert. The mixing of blood is just a poetic way of saying the gods gave us life. However, the rebuttal lies in the specificity of the texts. They don't just say the gods made humans. They describe the process. They talk about extracting the essence, about placing it in a womb, and about the decreeing of the fate of the new being. The Sumerian word for fate often referred to a fixed, predetermined path, much like a genetic code determines the potential of an organism. They also recorded a time when humans lived for those vast, multi-thousand-year spans mentioned in the king list. If we consider the possibility that a more advanced precursor civilization had mastered the basics of biology, then the sudden appearance of modern humans in the archaeological record, the great leap forward of 40,000 years ago, might not have been a natural evolution at all. It might have been an intervention, a deliberate shaping that the Sumerians remembered and recorded as their most foundational truth. As we move further into the investigation, we must address the global nature of this mystery. Sumer does not exist in a vacuum. Around the same time that the Sumerian cities were reaching their peak, other civilizations were appearing with similar suddenness in other parts of the world. In the Nile Valley, the first dynasties of Egypt were emerging with a fully formed system of hieroglyphs and a sophisticated understanding of stone masonry. In the Indus Valley, cities like Mohenjo-daro were being built with standardized brick sizes and advanced sewage systems that wouldn't be seen again for thousands of years. The paradox is the consistency of these civilizations. They all share a similar obsession with the stars, a similar vertical leap in technology, and a similar story of gods or teachers who came from elsewhere to provide the sparks of civilization. Skepticism argues that this is convergent evolution, that humans, when faced with similar environments like river valleys, will naturally come up with similar solutions. It's argued that the commonalities in their myths are simply a reflection of universal human psychology. But the rebuttal is found in the math. The same specific numbers appear in the architecture and the calendars of these disparate cultures. The number 72, for example, the number of years it takes for the stars to shift by 1 degree in the precessional cycle, is encoded into the dimensions of the Great Pyramid of Giza and the temples of Angkor Wat, and it is a recurring number in Sumerian mythology. These are not numbers you arrive at by accident. They are the results of long-term, multi-generational observation of the cosmos. The fact that these numbers are shared across continents suggests a shared source of information. It suggests that there was a mother culture, the civilization of the Lost Valley, the civilization of the era before the flood, that distributed its knowledge to various outposts around the globe. Sumer was simply the most vocal of these heirs, the one that wrote the most down on the most durable material. To truly feel the weight of this, we must consider the texture of the deep past. The earth is a giant grinding machine. Every year, the rain washes the mountains into the sea. Every year, the wind sands down the tallest monuments. In the grand timeline of the planet, 1,000,000 years is a blink. 100,000 years is a mere breath. Most of what we consider human history covers only the last few seconds of the Earth's day. We assume that because we don't see the ruins of a 10,000-year-old city, it never existed. But we forget how quickly the Earth can reclaim a city. If you were to abandon a modern city today, within 1,000 years, the skyscrapers would have collapsed, the roads would be buried under forests, and the very steel would have turned back into iron oxide. In 10,000 years, there would be nothing left but a slight anomaly in the soil's chemistry. The Sumerians were living in the shadow of this erasure. They were the ones who saw the last remnants of the old world before they crumbled into the silt. They weren't just starting something, they were mourning something. Their literature is saturated with a sense of loss and a deep, existential anxiety. They write about the days of old with a reverence that suggests they knew they were living in a diminished age. They were the bridge between the high-technology era of the gods and the slow, grinding struggle of the human future. This realization leads us to the climax of our investigation, the unifying theory of the Great Reset. This theory posits that humanity is not a newcomer to the stage of intelligence. We are a recurring character. We have reached heights of sophistication before, only to be knocked back to the Stone Age by the planet's natural cyclical catastrophes. These resets are triggered by things beyond our control: solar flares, crustal shifts, or the melting of the ice. Each time, a small fragment of the previous world survives. These survivors, the 7 sages of Sumer, the Viracocha of the Andes, the Quetzalcoatl of Mesoamerica, become the teachers of the new era. They use the last of their tools and the last of their knowledge to give the survivors a head start. Sumer was the most successful of these head starts. The fertile mud of the delta provided the perfect laboratory for rebuilding. The records they left behind were not meant for their contemporaries. They were meant for us. They were a message in a bottle, cast into the ocean of time, hoping that one day a civilization would emerge with the math and the science to decode the wedges in the clay. They wanted us to know that we are not alone in our struggle, and that we are not the first to look at the stars and wonder where we came from. The so what of this story is not just a matter of historical curiosity. It is a matter of modern survival. If our history is a series of resets, then we are currently living in a period of relative calm between storms. We have built a world that is incredibly sophisticated but also incredibly fragile. Our entire civilization depends on a thin layer of electronics and a constant supply of energy. We have forgotten the lessons of the clay. We have forgotten that the earth has the power to erase everything we have built in a single season. The Sumerian records are a call to humility. They remind us that the primitive ancestors we look down upon were actually the curators of a profound wisdom. They were the ones who kept the flame alive when the world was dark. They were the ones who took the time to press their thoughts into wet mud because they knew it was the only thing that would last. When we look at their tablets, we are not just looking at old tax records or ancient myths. We are looking at a survival manual. We are looking at a reminder that the progress we take for granted is not guaranteed. As we reach the final layers of this deep dive, the atmosphere of the Mesopotamian plain seems to shift. The heat is still there, the dust is still there, but the silence feels different. It no longer feels like the silence of a void. It feels like the silence of a library. Every mound of earth, every dry riverbed, is a potential page in a story that is still being written. The Sumerians are not gone. Their voices are still vibrating in the very air we breathe, in the way we count our minutes, in the way we map our circles, and in the way we look to the sky for answers. They were the guardians of the first grain, the ones who saw the end of one world and the beginning of another. And as we continue to dig, to brush away the salt and the silt, we are not just discovering their past. We are discovering our own future. We are learning to read the language of the earth, a language that tells us that nothing is truly lost. It is only waiting to be found. If you have felt the weight of these ancient stones and the pull of the deep past, know that this journey is only the beginning. The forgotten earth is not a place on a map. It is a state of awareness. It is the recognition that we are part of a vast, rhythmic cycle that spans millions of years. There are more records to be found, more mysteries to be decoded, and more layers of the earth to be explored. The wind continues to blow across the plains of Iraq, carrying the scent of the first rain and the dust of the first cities. It whispers a name that has been carried through the ages, a name that reminds us of our origin and our destination. Sumer, the land of the lords of brightness, the land where the story of humanity truly began, and where the answers to our greatest mysteries still lie buried, waiting for the light. To look into the heart of the Sumerian night is to witness a sky that was crowded with meaning. In the modern world, we have pushed the darkness back with the hum of electricity and the glare of LED bulbs. We have forgotten what it feels like to stand in a truly dark place, where the Milky Way is not a faint smear but a thick, luminous river of silver and shadow that seems close enough to touch. For the Sumerian astronomer priests, the sky was the ultimate library. It was the only thing that didn't change, the only thing that the mud and the floods couldn't reach. They watched it with a patience that is alien to us. They recorded the movement of every light, every flicker, and every slow, creeping shift of the constellations over the course of centuries. One of the most profound artifacts of this celestial obsession is a small cylinder seal, catalogued by modern museums as VA/243. It is a tiny roller of dark stone, no larger than a human thumb, but when it is pressed into wet clay and rolled across the surface, it reveals a scene that defies the standard timeline of human discovery. In the center of the image, a large, radiating star, the sun, is surrounded by 11 smaller spheres. These spheres vary in size, and their placement is not random. They correspond with remarkable accuracy to the planets of our solar system, including the distant giants that are invisible to the naked eye. The paradox of the VA/243 seal is found in its composition. Not only does it show the planets in their correct relative sizes, but it includes an extra body, a 12th member of the solar system family that the Sumerians called Nibiru, or the planet of the crossing. To the modern skeptic, this is where the story falls apart. Astronomers argue that there is no evidence for a large, undiscovered planet on a long elliptical orbit within our system. They suggest that the dots on the seal are simply stars, or perhaps a stylistic choice by an artist who had no interest in scientific accuracy. They point out that without telescopes, the Sumerians couldn't have known about the moons of Jupiter or the blue hue of Neptune. But the rebuttal is found in the Sumerian mathematics of the sky. They did not just draw pictures. They calculated distances. They used a system of spherical geometry that allowed them to predict the positions of the planets thousands of years into the future. They understood that the Earth was not a flat disk, but a sphere, and they calculated its circumference with an error of less than 1%. Most tellingly, they understood the concept of the precession of the equinoxes. This is the incredibly slow wobble of the Earth's axis, a movement that takes 25,920 years to complete one full circle. To even notice this movement, a civilization would need to keep accurate records of the star positions for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. The Sumerians appeared on the scene already possessing this number. They knew the length of the Great Year. This suggests that their astronomical knowledge was not a new discovery, but a legacy inherited from an era of observation that must have lasted for tens of thousands of years before the first brick was laid in Eridu. From the heights of the stars, we must descend back into the tactile world of the Sumerian House of Healing. In the ruins of the city of Nippur, archaeologists found a collection of tablets that serve as the world's oldest pharmacopoeia. These are not spells or incantations. They are chemical recipes. They describe the extraction of alkaloids from plants, the use of mineral salts, and the preparation of salves using the resin of trees. The Sumerians had a deep understanding of the chemistry of the natural world. They knew which plants would dull pain, which would fight infection, and which would help a wound to knit back together. The paradox here lies in the source of life seals. In several depictions, we see the goddess Ninhursag, known as the Mother of All, working in a laboratory-like setting surrounded by flasks and vessels. Beside her, there are depictions of what look like stylized trees, but with a specific repeating pattern of branches that looks more like a biological diagram than a plant. As we noted before, these patterns bear a haunting resemblance to the double helix of DNA. Skepticism tells us that this is purely coincidental. The Sumerians were a symbolic people. They used the imagery of the tree of life to represent the interconnectedness of all living things. The idea that they understood the molecular structure of the genetic code is seen as a modern fantasy projected onto the past. However, the rebuttal is found in the Sumerian account of the creation of the Adapa, the first model of a modern human. The texts describe a process where the essence of a god is mixed with the clay of the earth. But the word they use for clay is tiit, which can also be translated as that which contains life. They describe the resulting mixture being placed into the womb of a goddess, who then gives birth to the new being after a specific period of gestation. This is not the language of a clay-shaping myth. It is a technical description of an artificial fertilization process. The Sumerians even recorded the failures of this process, beings with missing limbs or organs that didn't work, suggesting a period of biological experimentation that took place in a facility they called the House of Shimti. If they were simply making up myths, why include the gritty, uncomfortable details of genetic mistakes? Why describe the essence as a physical substance that had to be carefully handled and processed? The investigation moves now to the very ground beneath the cities. The engineering of the Sumerian landscape was a feat of hydraulic mastery that has rarely been matched. The region between the Tigris and the Euphrates was a chaotic environment of seasonal floods and stagnant swamps. To live there, the Sumerians had to bend the water to their will. They built a network of canals that functioned as a massive living machine. These weren't just ditches. They were engineered waterways with sluice gates, regulators, and reservoirs that allowed them to control the flow of water with surgical precision. The paradox of Sumerian engineering is the bitumen mystery. Bitumen is a naturally occurring petroleum product, a thick, black tar that bubbles up from the earth in certain parts of Iraq. The Sumerians discovered that when they heated this substance and mixed it with sand or fibers, it became a revolutionary building material. It was the world's first plastic. They used it to waterproof their boats, to line their canals, and as a mortar for their bricks. This gave their structures a durability that allowed them to survive in a landscape that was constantly trying to dissolve them. Skepticism suggests that this was merely a pragmatic use of a locally available resource. If you have tar in your backyard, you eventually find a use for it. It is argued that the Sumerians stumbled upon the properties of bitumen through simple trial and error over many generations. But the rebuttal lies in the chemical complexity of their applications. They didn't just use raw bitumen. They refined it. They created different grades of the material for different purposes, some for flexibility, some for hardness, some for high heat resistance. They used it in the construction of their ziggurats to create expansion joints that allowed these massive structures to shift slightly without cracking during earthquakes or seasonal temperature changes. This is a high-level understanding of material science. It suggests a knowledge of the thermal and mechanical properties of petroleum that wouldn't be seen again until the industrial age. The Sumerians were not just using the earth, they were processing it. They were engineers who understood the stresses and strains of their materials, and they built their world to last for eternity. As we look deeper into the ziggurats themselves, we find the fourth cycle of our paradox, the architecture of resonance. These were not just platforms for temples. They were massive, tiered structures built with a precision that suggests an understanding of acoustics and vibration. The bricks were laid in specific patterns that created hollow chambers and channels within the walls. When the wind blew across the plains, or when the priests chanted within the inner sanctums, these structures would have vibrated at specific frequencies. The paradox is the purpose of these vibrations. Some researchers have suggested that the ziggurats were designed as massive resonators, intended to create a specific atmospheric effect or perhaps even to function as a form of communication device. Skepticism dismisses this as pseudoscience. Architects argue that the hollow spaces were simply a way to save on material or to provide ventilation in the stifling heat. They tell us that the orientation of the buildings to the stars was purely religious, a way to honor the gods of the sky without any functional purpose. But the rebuttal is found in the physical reality of the sites. The orientation of the ziggurats is accurate to within a fraction of a degree. They are aligned to the cardinal points and to the rising and setting of specific stars with a consistency that matches the Great Pyramid. Furthermore, the use of resonant materials like diorite and basalt in the inner chambers suggests an intentional control of sound. The Sumerian texts describe their temples as houses of the loud sound or houses that rise like a mountain. They speak of the voice of the temple being heard from miles away. If we consider the possibility that these structures were part of a global system of energy or communication, the gods who resided within them take on a very different character. They weren't just idols. They were the operators of a technology that the earth has since forgotten how to use. The story of Sumer is also the story of the first great quest. The Epic of Gilgamesh, carved onto 12 massive tablets, is the oldest piece of literature in the world. It tells the story of a king who, devastated by the death of his friend Enkidu, sets out on a journey to find the secret of eternal life. He travels to the ends of the earth, crosses the waters of death, and eventually finds a man named Utnapishtim, the Sumerian Noah, who survived the Great Flood. The paradox of the epic is its historical grounding. For a long time, Gilgamesh was considered a purely mythical figure. But archaeologists have since found inscriptions and artifacts that prove he was a real king who ruled the city of Uruk around 2700 BCE. The story describes his journey to a place called the Cedar Forest, where he encounters a monstrous guardian named Humbawa. The description of Humbawa is not that of a biological creature. It is described as having radiance, fire breath, and metal skin. It sounds more like a mechanical guardian or a security system than a beast of the woods. Skepticism tells us that this is just the creative flourishing of an ancient poet. Monsters are a staple of hero stories. The fire breath is just a metaphor for danger, and the metal skin is just a way to describe a tough hide. The quest for immortality is seen as a universal human theme, a way of processing the fear of death, rather than a literal search for a biological longevity treatment. But the rebuttal is found in the specific instructions Utnapishtim gives to Gilgamesh. He tells him of a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea, a plant that restores youth to a man. This is not a magical fountain or a ghostly blessing. It is a physical object, a biological resource. Utnapishtim himself is described as having lived for thousands of years, a survivor from the era before the flood. If the Epic of Gilgamesh is a true record of a king trying to reclaim the lost technology of the Anunnaki, the genetic longevity of the precursor civilization, then the story is not a tragedy of human mortality. It is a report on the final disappearance of the old world's power. Gilgamesh fails to bring the plant back, and with his failure, the last direct link to the age of the gods is severed. Humanity is left to face its short, brutal span of years alone. This leads us to the heart of the Great Reset theory. If Sumer was a reconstruction, a desperate attempt to reboot civilization using salvaged fragments of a higher technology, then we must ask, what caused the original collapse? The Sumerian records are unanimous on this point. It was the deluge. They describe a time when the fountains of the deep were opened and the floodgates of heaven were unbolted. This was not a local river flood. It was a planetary event. They describe the earth shouting and the darkness of the storm, covering the sun for 7 days and 7 nights. The paradox of the flood is its presence in every ancient culture on Earth. From the Maya in Central America to the Aboriginal tribes of Australia, from the mountains of Tibet to the islands of the Pacific, the story is the same. A great water came, the old world was destroyed, and a few survivors were tasked with starting over. Skepticism argues that this is because most civilizations are built near water, and every civilization eventually experiences a devastating local flood. These local memories, it is argued, were eventually exaggerated into a global myth. But the rebuttal is found in the geological evidence of the Younger Dryas. Approximately 12,800 years ago, the Earth experienced a sudden, violent shift in temperature. The glaciers that covered the northern hemisphere melted with a speed that defies traditional climatic models. This meltwater caused a global pulse of sea level rise, a series of meltwater pulses that would have seen the oceans rise by tens of feet in a matter of weeks. To anyone living on the coast or in a low-lying valley like the Persian Gulf, this would have been the end of the world. It would have been a wall of water that erased everything in its path. The Sumerian records are not a myth. They are an eyewitness account of the most significant geological event in human history. The Anunnaki in this context are not aliens from another star system, though the Sumerians often associated them with the heavens. They were the survivors of the High Era, the ones who had the foresight or the technology to survive the catastrophe. They were the ones who moved to the high ground, who stored the me in the mountain vaults, and who waited for the waters to recede. When they returned to the plains of Mesopotamia, they weren't gods in a supernatural sense. They were the remnant of a global civilization that had mastered the earth and the stars, and they found themselves in a world that had been scrubbed clean. Sumer was their laboratory. They took the surviving hunter-gatherers, the black-headed people, and gave them the tools of civilization. They taught them how to write so the knowledge wouldn't be lost again. They taught them math so they could track the cycles of the planet and predict the next disaster. They taught them agriculture so they could sustain large populations. But they also kept a distance. They remained the lords, the shining ones, living in their secluded temple complexes, managing the reconstruction of the planet from behind the scenes. As we look at the modern world through the lens of Sumer, the stakes of our own civilization become terrifyingly clear. We are currently in the middle of a long summer, a period of relative climatic stability that has lasted for about 10,000 years. This stability is what allowed Sumer to flourish, and what has allowed us to build our own global network. But the Sumerian records remind us that the long summer always ends. The Earth is a restless sleeper. The cycles of the Great Year, the 25,920-year precession, are not just a way to track the stars. They are a clock that marks the arrival of the Great Resets. The Sumerians were obsessed with the number 3600, the Sar. They used it to measure the reigns of their kings and the cycles of their gods. Some have suggested that this number refers to the orbital period of a celestial body that periodically passes through our system, causing gravitational disturbances that trigger these resets. Whether it is a physical planet, a solar cycle, or a crustal displacement, the message of the clay is the same. The erasure is coming back. The so what of the Sumerian mystery is a call to change the way we see our place in time. We are not at the end of history. We are not the pinnacle of human achievement. We are just one of many iterations of a species that keeps trying to build a permanent home on a temporary world. The Sumerians wrote their story in clay because they knew it was the only thing that could survive the water and the heat. They were speaking to us across the abyss of 6 millennia, trying to warn us that our steel and our glass and our digital clouds are illusions. They wanted us to know that the most important thing a civilization can do is to remember where we came from, to remember the mistakes of the past, and to remember that we are part of a larger cosmic rhythm. The Sumerian tablets are a seed vault for the mind. They contain the DNA of our civilization, the core truths about our biology, our planet, and our connection to the stars. As the investigation reaches its climax, we find ourselves standing once more in the dust of Iraq. The modern world is encroaching on the ancient mounds. Oil rigs hum in the distance, pulling the burning water of the Sumerians from the deep earth to power our own frantic age. Wars have been fought over this soil, and much of the archaeological record has been lost to looting and destruction. It is as if the earth is trying to erase the records one last time. But even as the bricks crumble and the tablets are broken, the me remain. They are in the way we count our hours. They are in the way we divide our circles. They are in the very structure of our laws and our science. We are speaking Sumerian every time we look at a clock or a map. We are living in the house that the 7 sages built. The final lesson of the forgotten earth is one of continuity. We are not a species of accidents. We are a species of survivors. The Sumerian records are a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be erased. They tell us that even when the world is destroyed, even when the gods depart and the waters rise, something remains. The first grain is always planted again. The first word is always written again. The story never truly ends. It only waits for a new hand to pick up the stylus and begin again. The sun dips below the horizon, and for a brief moment, the ruins of Sumer are bathed in a deep, golden light. It is the same light that shone on the first king of Eridu 28,000 years ago. The stars begin to emerge, one by one, appearing in the exact positions that the ancient priests predicted they would. The great year continues its slow, majestic turn, and beneath the feet of the traveler, the clay waits in the darkness, holding the secrets of a humanity that has lived and died and risen again, more times than we can count. If you have stayed with this story through the heat and the silt, through the paradox and the silence, it is because you are one of the ones who is starting to remember. The echoes of the first grain are calling to you, inviting you to look deeper, to question the stories you have been told, and to find your own place in the long, atmospheric journey of the forgotten earth. The investigation is far from over. There are more cities buried in the sand, more seals waiting to be rolled, and more voices waiting to be heard. The wind is rising now, moving across the plains, carrying the dust of the first world into the lungs of the new. It is a breath of deep time, a reminder that we are all made of the same clay and the same stardust. Listen closely to the silence. Beneath the noise of the modern world, the Sumerians are still speaking. They are telling us that the future is hidden in the past, and that the only way to move forward is to turn our gaze back toward the beginning. The true genius of the Sumerian mind was not found in what they built with their hands, but in how they organized the universe within their thoughts. They did not see the world as a chaotic collection of events, but as a vast, interlocking machine governed by numbers. This leads us into the heart of the sixth cycle of our investigation, the sexagesimal system and the mathematical architecture of time itself. While the rest of the ancient world was struggling with basic tallies, the Sumerians were using a base 60 system, the same system that allows us even today to divide an hour into 60 minutes and a circle into 360 degrees. The paradox of the number 60 is its unnatural perfection. In a world of 10 fingers and 10 toes, base 10 is the logical, biological choice for counting. Yet the Sumerians chose 60, a number that is divisible by almost everything: 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. It is the perfect number for a civilization obsessed with fractions, cycles, and the geometry of the spheres. But why would a group of early farmers need a system that can calculate the precession of the equinoxes or the orbital mechanics of the planets? Skepticism suggests that this was merely a practical evolution for trade. If you are dividing a harvest or a plot of land, 60 is a very friendly number for division. It is argued that the Sumerians simply enjoyed the symmetry of the math and eventually applied it to the stars as their culture grew more complex. We are told that our modern use of their system is just a lingering habit, a cultural fossil that survived through the Greeks and Romans. But the rebuttal is found in the Gudea cylinders and the architectural plans of the great temples. These documents show that the Sumerians were using their math to align their structures with the vibrations of the earth itself. They understood that the planet has a pulse, a low-frequency hum that resonates through the bedrock. By building their temples in accordance with the ratios of 60, they were essentially creating giant tuning forks. They weren't just building houses for the gods. They were building interfaces. Their math wasn't a tool for counting sheep. It was a language designed to describe the fundamental frequencies of reality. They saw the number 60 as the signature of the Creator, a mathematical constant that linked the movement of a grain of sand to the rotation of a galaxy. This level of conceptualization doesn't emerge from the dirt of a farm. It descends from a high-level understanding of physics that the Earth has since forgotten. To truly understand this, we must descend once more into the physical Earth, specifically to the city of Eridu. This was the first city, the place where the Sumerians believed civilization began. When archaeologists dug through the layers of Eridu, they found something that troubled the traditional narrative of progress. Usually, as you dig deeper, the buildings get simpler and the artifacts become more primitive. But at Eridu, the deepest, oldest temple, Temple 18, was already a sophisticated structure with an altar and a central nave. Beneath this temple, the archaeologists found something even more mysterious: a thick layer of clean, sterile sand. This sand was not deposited by a river or a windstorm. It was placed there intentionally. It was as if the builders wanted to insulate their sacred space from the ground itself. Beneath that sand lay the Abzu, the subterranean ocean of sweet water that the god Enki was said to inhabit. The Sumerians believed that Eridu was a plug or a cap on this deep, watery abyss. The paradox of Eridu is the source of its water. The city sat on the edge of a marsh, yet it had access to sweet water that seemed to bubble up from the very heart of the earth. Skepticism tells us that this was simply an artesian well, a natural geological feature that the Sumerians personified as a god. They tell us that the Abzu was just a poetic name for the groundwater table. But the rebuttal is found in the Sumerian description of what was inside the Abzu. They didn't describe it as a simple pool of water. They described it as a shimmering house, a place of light and sound where the me were kept and where the fate of humanity was decreed. They described Enki not as a spirit, but as a master engineer who directed the waters and fastened the sky to the earth. If we look at the layers of Eridu through the lens of technology, the Abzu sounds like a subterranean facility, a place where the survivors of the Great Reset could preserve their most advanced tools away from the scouring winds and the rising tides of the surface. Eridu wasn't just a city, it was the control room for the reconstruction of Mesopotamia. This brings us to the elusive me, those physical objects of power that were so central to Sumerian life. In the texts, the me are listed with exhausting detail. There were me for the kindling of fire, me for the descending into the underworld, me for the art of the blacksmith, and even me for the standard of the king. These weren't ideas. They were things. They could be stolen, they could be lost, and they could be activated. The paradox of the me is their sheer variety. How could one category of objects cover everything from law to metallurgy to religious ritual? Skepticism insists that these were symbolic tokens, like a crown or a scepter, that represented the authority to perform certain tasks. It is argued that stealing the me was simply a metaphorical way of describing one city-state taking over the cultural traditions of another. But the rebuttal lies in the Inmerker and the Lord of Errata, one of the oldest epic poems. In this story, two kings compete not with armies, but with challenges of wisdom and the exchange of inscribed tablets. They speak of the me as if they were blueprints or software disks. If you had the me of weaving, you had the technical knowledge to build a loom and process wool. If you had the me of kingship, you had the administrative protocols to run a city. These were the compressed files of a lost civilization. The 7 sages didn't just teach the Sumerians. They handed them the hardware and the software to run a civilization. Sumer was a turnkey society, handed over to a group of survivors who were taught how to push the buttons but may not have fully understood how the machine worked. This explains the strange, ritualistic nature of Sumerian life. They were a people obsessed with doing things the right way, with following the exact decrees handed down from the era before the flood. They were like people living in the ruins of a high-tech laboratory, carefully following a manual they could only partially read, terrified that if they missed a step, the lights would go out forever. This existential dread is the underlying rhythm of all Sumerian records. They knew they were living on borrowed time, using borrowed tools, in a world that had already been destroyed once. As we look at the textures of their daily existence, we see the 7th cycle of our investigation, the anomaly of Sumerian medicine. On a small clay tablet found in the city of Nippur, a physician wrote out a series of prescriptions. These recipes involve the use of willow bark for pain, the natural source of salicylic acid, or aspirin. They involve the use of fir resin as an antiseptic and alkali mixed with fats to create soap. The paradox is the absence of magic in these specific texts. While later Babylonian and Assyrian medicine became heavily infested with demons and spells, the earliest Sumerian medical records are startlingly empirical. They focus on the physical symptoms and the chemical remedies. Skepticism tells us that this was just a brief golden age of common sense before superstition took over. They say that the Sumerians simply observed what worked and wrote it down. But the rebuttal is found in their knowledge of the human circulatory system. They had terms for the beating of the heart and the movement of the blood that suggest an understanding of the body's internal plumbing that wouldn't be discovered again until the 17th century. They even had a word for nerves, the strings that carry the commands of the mind to the limbs. This is not the knowledge of a people who just started dissecting animals. This is a remnant science. It is the simplified version of a much deeper medical tradition, a tradition that understood the body as a chemical and electrical system. The Sumerians were practicing first aid based on the medical textbooks of a civilization that may have mastered the very foundations of life itself. The so what of this medical paradox is perhaps the most personal part of the Sumerian mystery. If they were the heirs to a civilization that understood the secrets of biology, then their stories of longevity and healing are not just myths. They are memories of a time when the human condition was different. They speak of a golden age when there was no snake, there was no scorpion, there was no hyena, there was no wolf, there was no fear, there was no terror, man had no rival. This isn't a description of a fantasy land. It's a description of a world under total environmental and biological control. A world where the Anunnaki had engineered the landscape and the genome to create a perfect, stable cradle for life. And then the Great Reset happened. The Sumerian records tell us that the Enlil, the Lord of the Storm, became disturbed by the clamor of humanity and decided to wipe the slate clean. If we strip away the personality of the god, we are left with a description of a planet that has reached a tipping point. The clamor of humanity could be a metaphor for overpopulation, for environmental stress, or for the disruption of the Earth's natural cycles. The storm was the planet's reaction, a sudden, violent correction that restored the balance by erasing the cause of the imbalance. The Sumerians were the ones who had to live in the after. They were the ones who saw the shining cities of the Abzu turn into mounds of mud. They were the ones who had to learn how to farm the silt and hunt the wild animals that had returned to the ruins. They were a people of deep memory, and their records are a long atmospheric warning to us. They are telling us that civilization is not a one-way street of progress. It is a loop. As we move toward the conclusion of our deep dive, we must address the final paradox: the return of the gods. The Sumerian texts end with a sense of abandonment. They tell us that the Anunnaki eventually departed, leaving the kingship in the hands of mortal men. They describe the gods retreating to their celestial chambers or ascending to the heights of heaven. Skepticism says this is just a way for the priests to explain why their gods no longer answered their prayers or walked among them. It is argued that as the Sumerian city-states became more complex and war-torn, the divine presence was moved further into the realm of the abstract and the spiritual. The gods became ghosts because the people no longer needed them as physical rulers. But the rebuttal is found in the Lamentation for Sumer and Uar. This is a heartbreaking series of poems that describe the literal destruction of the Sumerian civilization by a storm that sounds more like a nuclear fallout or a chemical cloud than a weather event. It speaks of a vapor that turned the sun to darkness, a smoke that clung to the walls like a wet garment, and a fire that devoured the mountains. In the wake of this catastrophe, the Anunnaki fled. They didn't just leave, they evacuated. The texts describe them flying like birds from their temple towers, abandoning their people to the evil wind. This suggests that the gods were not invincible. They were part of the same physical reality as the Sumerians, and they were subject to the same planetary risks. If they were the elite survivors of a previous era, they eventually realized that the Earth was no longer a stable place for their high-technology lifestyle. They left the Sumerians with the records, the math, and the me, and they disappeared into the shadows of history, or perhaps into the deeper reaches of the solar system they had mapped so accurately. Today, we stand at a point on the Great Years Clock that is eerily similar to the time of the Sumerian lamentation. We have reached a level of global interconnectedness and technological power that rivals the high era of the precursors. We have mapped the stars, we have decoded the genome, and we have built cities that can be seen from space. But we have also ignored the deep time lessons of the clay. We have built our world on the assumption of a static, unchanging Earth. The Sumerian records are not a dead history. They are a living mirror. They show us a version of ourselves that existed 6,000 years ago, a version that was trying to hold onto the light as the darkness of the Great Reset closed in. They remind us that the forgotten Earth is always there, waiting just beneath the surface, ready to recycle our steel and our glass back into the dust from which it came. To walk through the ruins of Uruk or Nippur is to walk through our own future. The silence of those places is not an empty silence. It is a waiting silence. The clay tablets are still there, millions of them, buried under the shifting sands, holding the me of 1,000 generations. They are waiting for us to stop shouting and start listening. They are telling us that the only way to survive the next turn of the great year is to find the Abzu within ourselves, the deep, quiet well of knowledge and resilience that can survive any storm. As the wind continues to blow across the southern plains, it carries the same salt and the same dust that it did in the days of Gilgamesh. The stars continue their slow, 25,920-year dance, oblivious to our wars and our worries. The great year moves on, and the Sumerian records remain, the first and most profound attempt by our species to write our name in the book of the world, to say, we were here, we remembered, we did not go quietly into the dark. The investigation into the forgotten earth does not end with a period. It ends with an ellipsis. It ends with the realization that we are part of a story that is far older than we were told, and far more meaningful than we can imagine. The clay is still wet, the stylus is in our hands, and the shining ones are watching from the depths of the stars, waiting to see if we will learn to read the signs before the waters rise again. If you have felt the atmosphere of this ancient world, if the paradoxes of Sumer have opened a door in your mind, then the forgotten earth has achieved its purpose. You are no longer just a viewer, you are a witness. You are a part of the memory. And as you return to your own time, to your own cities of glass and light, carry with you the weight of the clay. Remember the Sar, the Na, and the Me. Remember that the earth remembers. The journey continues, one layer at a time, one paradox at a time, until the silence of the silt finally gives up its last and greatest secret. Until then, keep your eyes on the stars and your feet on the ancient ground. The story of humanity is only just beginning. To understand the final layer of this story, we must look at the people who came after the Sumerians but before ourselves. In the 6th century BCE, a man named Nabonidus sat on the throne of Babylon. He is often called the world's first archaeologist, but his interest was not merely academic. He was a man obsessed with the old foundations. He spent his reign digging into the ruins of cities like Ur and Larsa, searching for the foundation deposits left by kings who had ruled thousands of years before him. On a clay cylinder found in the ruins of a temple to the sun god, Nabonidus records his discovery of a foundation stone laid by a king named Naram-Sin. He writes with a sense of awe that the stone had not been seen for 3,200 years. The paradox of Nabonidus is the precision of his excavations. In a world without ground-penetrating radar or modern surveying tools, he was able to locate the exact corners of temples that had been buried under 20 feet of sand for millennia. He spoke of ancient records that guided his shovels, records that told him exactly where the original blueprints of the world were hidden. Skepticism tells us that this was a political move. Nabonidus was a usurper to the throne, and by discovering ancient foundation stones, he was trying to manufacture a sense of legitimacy. It is argued that he simply dug until he hit something old and then claimed it was exactly what he was looking for. But the rebuttal is found in the physical reality of what he uncovered. Nabonidus didn't just find stones. He found evidence of a continuity of knowledge that spanned the entire duration of the long summer. He found that the temples he was restoring were built upon even older structures, which were in turn built upon the sterile sand of the era immediately following the deluge. He realized that he was part of a chain of custodians, a line of watchers who were tasked with keeping the earthly mirrors of the stars in their proper places. He understood that if the temples were not aligned correctly, the connection between the heavens and the earth would be broken, and the Great Reset would return. This leads us to the most unsettling part of the Sumerian legacy, the concept of the end of the age. The Sumerians did not believe that history moved in a straight line toward progress. They believed in the circular path. They saw the earth as a clock, and the hands of that clock were the stars. They knew that when the sun rose in a new constellation during the spring equinox, a shift that happens every 2,160 years, the flavor of the world changed. They called these periods ages. They knew that certain ages were stable, while others were the time of the turning. The paradox of the ages is how a civilization could possibly track something that takes more than 2,000 years to manifest. To see the shift of the equinox, you need a record-keeping system that survives for 100 generations. You need a language that doesn't change and a math that doesn't warp. The Sumerians had both. They tracked the precession of the equinoxes with a terrifying accuracy, marking the transition from the age of the bull to the age of the ram. They knew that we are currently living in the tail end of a cycle, a time when the vibration of the planet begins to shift once more. Skepticism insists that this is all archaeoastronomy gone mad. They tell us that the Sumerians were just tracking the seasons for farming, and the larger numbers are just a byproduct of their complex math. It is argued that there is no energy or vibration associated with the stars, and that the idea of a great reset triggered by celestial cycles is nothing more than ancient superstition designed to give meaning to a chaotic world. But the rebuttal is written in the ice cores of Greenland and the sediment of the ocean floor. Modern science has confirmed that the Earth does indeed go through millennial cycles, the Milankovitch cycles, where the tilt and the wobble of the planet's axis affect the distribution of solar energy, triggering the beginning and end of ice ages. We are just now discovering what the Sumerians seem to have known from the very beginning. The planet is a rhythmic system, and we are subject to its beat. The Anunnaki were not just teachers of agriculture. They were the keepers of the clock. They gave humanity the tools to track the time of the earth so that we would not be caught unaware when the waters of the deep returned. Imagine, for a moment, the atmosphere of a Sumerian temple at the height of the great year. The air is thick with the scent of cedar and bitumen. The walls are covered in lapis lazuli and gold, reflecting the light of oil lamps. The priests stand in the inner sanctum, not praying to a distant, invisible God, but observing the instruments of the me. They are measuring the shadows cast by the sun, tracking the wanderers through the houses of the zodiac. They are watching for the sign of the turning. They are the early warning system for a species with amnesia. They know that the clay they are writing on is the only thing that will survive the fire and the flood, and they are frantically pressing the history of the future into the wet mud. The Abzu itself, that subterranean ocean of sweet water, takes on a new meaning in this final layer. If the Earth's surface is a place of erasure, then the only safe place for a civilization to store its core data is underground. In the last few decades, archaeologists have found evidence of massive, sophisticated underground cities in places like Derinkuyu in Turkey. Cities that could house 20,000 people, complete with ventilation shafts, oil presses, and rolling stone doors that could only be opened from the inside. These cities were carved into the volcanic rock at a time that aligns perfectly with the climatic upheavals of the end of the Ice Age. The paradox of these underground heavens is their technical complexity. They are not caves. They are engineered habitats. They are the physical manifestation of the Sumerian Abzu. If the survivors of the High Era knew that a global catastrophe was coming, they wouldn't have built more skyscrapers. They would have built bunkers. They would have retreated into the heart of the mountain and waited for the storm of Enlil to pass. Sumer was the emergence. It was the moment when the people of the Abzu finally came back to the surface, bringing with them the me and the seeds and the law. This is the unifying truth of the forgotten earth. We are not the first to reach this level of global complexity, and we are likely not the last. The Sumerian records are a message in a bottle from a group of people who had seen the end of the world and were trying to prevent it from happening again. They gave us the math of the circle and the division of the hour as a way to keep us in sync with the planet. They gave us the me of medicine and metallurgy so we wouldn't have to start from zero. And they gave us the king list as a reminder that kingship is a responsibility to the future, not just a privilege of the present. The so what of this journey is a transformation of our perspective. When you look at a modern city, you shouldn't see a permanent achievement. You should see a temporary architecture. You should see a layer of silt waiting to happen. This is not a cause for despair, but for a profound kind of empowerment. If we know the cycles, we can prepare for them. If we understand the math of the stars, we can predict the turning. The Sumerians were not trying to frighten us. They were trying to wake us up. They were telling us that the earth is a living, breathing being, and we are the consciousness that it has evolved to track its own heartbeat. We are currently living in a digital Abzu. We store our knowledge in clouds of light and pulses of electricity. We think we are more advanced than the Sumerians because we have computers, but our records are the most fragile in history. A single massive solar flare, a breath of the sun, could wipe out our entire digital legacy in an afternoon. If that were to happen, we would be worse off than the Sumerians. We would have no clay tablets to fall back on. We would have no me to guide our reconstruction. We would be a species of billions with the collective memory of a goldfish. This is why the study of Sumer is the most important scientific endeavor of our age. It is the reverse engineering of our own origins. Every tablet translated, every seal rolled, and every ziggurat surveyed is a piece of the great map being put back together. We are looking for the source code of our civilization. And as we find it, we realize that the gods of the Sumerians were not external beings. They were the potentials of humanity itself. They were the scientists, the artists, and the engineers that we were meant to become. The final atmosphere of the forgotten earth is one of a quiet, starlit vigilance. To be a watcher in the modern world is to look at the news and the weather not as random events, but as the shifting of the weight. It is to realize that the dust of Sumer is in our lungs and the blood of the Anunnaki is in our veins. We are the survivors. We are the ones who made it through the fire and the flood, and we are the ones who are tasked with carrying the me into the next age. As the sun sets over the world, casting long, dramatic shadows over our own ziggurats of steel and glass, let us listen to the silence of the southern plains. Let us hear the whisper of the wind through the reeds of the marshland. It is the sound of 6,000 years of waiting. It is the sound of the clay waiting to be read. The Sumerians are not a primitive past that we have left behind. They are a sophisticated future that we are just beginning to catch up with. The story of the first grain is still being told. The first word is still being written. And the kingship that descended from heaven is still within our reach if we have the humility to look back at the beginning. The great year is turning. The stars are shifting. The sign of the turning is in the sky, and the forgotten earth is calling us home, back to the Abzu, back to the me, and back to the truth of who we really are. This is the end of the long-form narration, but the beginning of the deeper investigation. The layers of the earth are deep, and the stars are patient. There is always another mystery to solve, another paradox to explore, and another story to tell in the long, atmospheric journey of humanity. Keep your eyes on the horizon, and remember, the mud of today is the history of tomorrow. The forgotten earth is never truly forgotten. It is only waiting for the next turn of the wheel. If you have stayed through the silence and the storm, you are now a part of the record. You are a carrier of the deep memory. And as the light fades, the only question that remains is, What will you write on your own tablet of clay? What will you leave for the ones who come after the next reset? The stylus is in your hand. The clay is wet. The stars are watching. Begin.